So, what do you think about the new experiments, second and third experiments? Were they clear?
Well, at least for the second study, I had a few issues with understanding how exactly they measured what, and it seemed a bit unscientific to me. And also the number of participants and also the age of them seemed a bit odd to me, uh, and seemed like it is not able to produce reliable results.
You're speaking about the second study, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
But then again, I haven't
what?
read a lot of those studies, so maybe it's just me.
Yeah, no, but we are here to learn. So, um, the observation on the age of the participant. I mean, they are. Oh, no, study 3, sorry. For the measures, your comment on the measures, you're right, and not. So it's a scientific approach, the one that they are taking. We're talking about paragraph 3.2.4, where they are explaining to you they have used a questionnaire with 14 items to measure their variables, to measure the new variables that are trust in government and support for government. Questionnaires are widely employed. Are you lost?
No, we're there.
No, please
Okay.
keep on talking. Sorry.
Okay, good. Uh, um, So this is an approach that is commonly used in research that is providing participants to a study with a battery of questions relating to, for example, trust um, or support in order to see whether there is consistency in the responses that they are providing for um, measuring how much trust they had in the government. So it's not that the approach that they are using is not scientific. It is, and it's widely employed. But one thing you are right. It's becoming more and more judged because we cannot really know if people are replying to these questionnaires in with what they think really or with what they expect the one that is interviewing them want to hear. So, for example, if you ask someone, I don't know, did you collect any garbage from the street yesterday? You might say, yes, I did, just because you expect, you feel a desirability bias. That is, this person is asking me because I had to collect the trash from the street. But in reality, you might have not done this. So this is, questionnaires are becoming more and more, less and less used unless they are backed up with something else, with some other measures.
I mean, it also confused me a bit concerning the control measures because they named them in point 3.2.5, but correct me if I'm wrong, but they didn't really explain how they applied those control measures.
Yeah, this is true. The control measures, well, it's not that they didn't explain why they applied, but they didn't explain the rationale behind them. Because they said they just provided the list of control variables that they are using, but it didn't explain in study 2 how they are related to their constructs. They have done a better job in study 3, if I remember correctly, where they explicitly said how control variables were expected to be related to their constructs, their main constructs, but they didn't do that in study 2. So this point, you are right. And for the way they applied it, I don't know if you, because you come from law, so I don't know if you have, you are familiar with the regressions or this kind of research.
I mean, not scientifically. I never took a course on it, but I'm wrapping my head around.
Okay, so the point is that a control variable is something that you add in a regression just to verify whether effects are constant if you add other kind of explanations. So when they say there is a control variable, what they mean is just that they are adding into the regression more predictors. There is not a specific strategy behind it or behind the application of control variables. If you look at table 3, you see there is in column 1 a regression model without control variables because they are not, you don't have coefficients for female age, minority, income, missing income, etc. In column 2, they have added to the same regression model the control variables to see whether the results are consistent when you control for the gender of the person, for their age, for them, whether they are part of a minority. So in this case, this is clear how they use the control variables. What is not clear and not explained is why they decided to choose just gender and age and not, for example, I don't know, education. And there was another point that I wanted to emphasize. That is, you remember when we have discussed the first study, I told you their measures were not backed up with the prior literature, which was not good. In this second study, if you look at the survey measure section, when they are introducing the questionnaire that they have performed, they are also citing the sources where they have retrieved the questionnaire items. So they didn't invent anything, and in this case, it's backed up by prior literature, which is good. Are there other concerns on study 2 and 3?
I found it a little surprising that they didn't put the specifications up front before they were showing the tables. I know they were explaining the variables and the control measures, but I didn't really get why they didn't follow the same approaches in study 1.
Yeah, and this is true. This is something that is missing in study 2 and 3, but you have also to understand that study 2 and 3, they have used them to reinforce findings in study 1, but it's not the main backdrop that study 2 and 3 have. The main backdrop that they have is that they are laboratory studies, so you don't really know if you are testing these hypotheses, and they have adopted some measures to control that effectively people are showing a reaction to a real situation. The problem is that these are studies that have been done in the laboratory, which means you cannot be sure that people will behave exactly in this way in real life for study 2. And for study 3, it is also an hypothesized scenario, which makes it even weaker respect to a real situation, because they were asking people to imagine to be in a situation. And when you imagine, I don't know, it's like when you are planning a travel, and you imagine yourself once you will be, I don't know, in New York, and you say, oh, in day 1, I will see everything in the city. But then when you are in the place, you don't see anything because because it's too huge for doing so. So one thing is imagining something, and another thing is really acting. And another backdrop that there was in study 3 is that they didn't make any kind of control for social desirability biases. And social desirability biases are biases in the answers that people are providing just because they are guessing what you are looking for, and they want to make you happy because they think you expect them to behave in a certain manner. And this is confirmed by the fact that they find high significances in both moderate and high responsiveness scenario when they ask for the engagement, but they don't find it for low. So people in the moderate and high responsiveness scenario might feel kind of obliged to engage in actions with the government and to have a positive feeling toward the government. So they are guessing you expect it, and they're providing you the answer you expect rather than what they really think. So these are the drawbacks, and this is why it's important to combine multiple studies. I'm not saying that these are not reliable. They have done all these things are to waste. No, because they still found results, and they still tried to minimize the problems related to unreliability of their estimates. They failed on the desirability in reality, but still they were following good practices in applying these methodologies. Okay, so the last part of the... Are there further questions, concerns that you would like to raise?
One last thing, which is in table 4. I found that incredibly hard to understand, as all of the columns, if you just look at it and you said it needs to be self-explanatory, and all of them look exactly the same. That was just one more observation I made. But yeah. Otherwise, we can move on.
But here I agree with you. It's not really self-explanatory because it seems every column seems the same. You have to have a good eye to understand what is the difference between the columns that is past responsiveness.
Yeah.
And it's the very at the very end of the table. So yeah, it's self-explanatory, because if you pay a lot of attention, you see it, but they could do something to highlight it better. That's true.
Maybe put it in the first row below the engage row or so.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's hard to find.
Yes. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's go to the discussion part. There are 2 points with discussion, 3.3.7, and then we go to the general discussion. Who wants to read? Christian, please.
Yeah, sure. Taken together, these results make 3 important contributions to the literature on co-production. First, they highlight how when a consumer is in a co-productive relationship with an organization, such as the government, operational transparency can enact in the same person the mutually reinforcing set of causal mechanisms that exist among consumers and employees in a traditional service interaction. We find that transparency simultaneously increases engagement by bolstering attitudes toward the government and by helping the individual feel that his or her own engagement is impactful and rewarding. Second, they highlight the important contingent effects of an organization's past level of responsiveness to an individual's future willingness to engage. When past levels of government responsiveness have been moderate to high, participants report feeling more efficiencies, which influences their willingness to engage both directly and indirectly via the causal channels through which operational transparency increases engagement. As a consequence, operational transparency can only lead to increased levels of engagement when past levels of responsiveness leave individuals feeling sufficiently efficacious to perceive the organization's efforts worthy of their engagement, and their engagement sufficiently impactful to be worthy of their time. And finally, the results demonstrate the role of support for the organization, as well as the perception of the effort it expends in responding to requests and the impact of engaging with it in affecting an individual's willingness to engage. We find that an individual's degree of support for the government is driven by whether it engages in operational transparency and the degree of efficiency the individual feels from his or her past interactions with it, which influences support through the individual's level of trust in the organization, but also by outside factors that drive individual differences in levels of support. Relatedly, we find that the potential of operational transparency to bolster trust and engagement is higher in contexts where people have low perceptions of the organization as an effortful partner when response to requests, and low perceptions of the impact of their own engagement, perceptions that operational transparency can offset.
Okay. So here they are providing a short resume of their findings. Let me just tell you the first point, that is, you see here they are citing nothing. And even though it's not the best thing to do in a study, the discussion part is the part in which you are allowed to be more creative and less reliant on extant literature. I'm not saying that you don't have to cite anything as they did, but this is the part in which you can cite literature to clarify a gap, but you can also build with your own words. And yes, there was since it was a combination of different studies, when you have a study with multiple experiments involved or multiple methodologies involved, usually you have a very brief discussion of the results and then a more general discussion. So I'm not criticizing how short or whether they clarified here the gap that they are filling, just because I expect it to be more clear in the general discussion. Christian, please, can you go ahead?
Sure. Through three studies conducted in the field and in a laboratory, we investigated the effects of operational transparency on people's trust in an engagement with government services. Study 1 showed that when the City of Boston introduced operational transparency by providing residents with photographs of the work it performed in response to their service requests, residents increased their subsequent levels of engagement, submitting 60% more service requests in 38% more categories over the ensuing 13 months. Moreover, we find that the effects were strongest among residents who had previously experienced the government to be at least moderately responsive to their requests in the past. Study 2 builds on these results by showing that when Boston residents interacted with a website that visually depicted resident service requests and efforts by the city to resolve them, reported levels of trust in and support for government increased. However, when transparency revealed a growing backlog of unresolved service requests portraying government to be less responsive, residents reported being less trusting and supportive than residents who had not experienced occupational transparency.
Okay, stop here.
Yeah.
So, as you can see, in a discussion, and also in your own research papers, the first part of the discussion, you need to summarize the findings of your research. Briefly, not to report everything, but you have to summarize what are your findings as they have done. So here, this part is good. Please go ahead.
These studies highlight that transparency alone is not a panacea for trust and engagement. It must be paired with a responsive operation for benefits to emerge. Study 3 replicates and extends the results from the first two studies by mapping the mechanisms linking operational transparency and responsiveness to trust and engagement. We find that in co-productive settings where the customer takes on the roles of both consumer and producer of the service, operational transparency increases perceptions that the organization is expending effort on the customer's behalf and thus is a trusted partner for engagement, as well as heightens customers' beliefs that their engagement is meaningful and worthwhile. Moreover, we document a critical role for responsiveness, which by increasing feelings of personal efficiency increases people's willingness to engage, both directly and indirectly, by increasing their perceptions of effort and impact. In this way, operational transparency in co-productive settings where successful service delivery depends on the customers trusting and engaging with the organization activates similar causal chains to those separately experienced by customers and employees in other service contexts.
Okay, so good and bad things of this discussion, and also tied together with the other smaller discussion. It's clear to read, but okay, let's see our little guide on the discussion parts, contributions of the study. Did you get what is the contribution of this study?
Yeah, that's well summarized in the first paragraph, I think, which is summarizing the results. Isn't that the contribution?
No. So the first paragraph is just summarizing what they have found. They have made explicit the contribution of their study just in paragraph 3.3.7. The good thing is that they are clearly stating what are the contributions of their study according to them. The problem is that it's not tied to anything that we know in the literature. So, for example, they start by saying our study makes three important contributions to the literature on co-production. Even though during the studies they have mentioned co-production sometimes, if you remember, in the part in their introduction and in their let's call it theoretical background, even though it was not like a deep analysis of the theories, they never used the term co-production before. So this is a novelty that is coming at the end of the paper, which is very strange. Because usually you should make it clear since the beginning of your paper which one is the literature you want to contribute to. And the second problem is that, yeah, it's clear how this study is contributing, what this study is finding, and what are the implications for that. It's not clear how these findings are contributing to the literature or to what we already know, because they didn't mention what are the gaps, and they didn't mention in any point here how these findings are related to past findings. Is the contribution clearly discussed at the end of the paper? I would say yes here, because they write nicely. Not because they are saying how it's this question is more related to the writing style they have rather than to the content. The discussion is clear because there are no flaws in the logics that they are explaining. And is the contribution consistent with the expectations raised up front? Well, again, they didn't really have a clear hypothesis beforehand, but they did what they promised. That is, they promised to investigate the relationship between transparency, engagement, and trust. And this is what they have done with all these studies altogether. Contribution is correctly inferred and supported by the empirical results. Again, here, I think this is the part where they are clearer and we can like this study. And the last point is the more critical for this research paper, because they are really not mentioning how it's contributing or adding to prior knowledge. This is the part that is more critical in that paper.
I have a question. Excuse me.
Yes.
It mentioned like in the last part of the results, like they document the critical role of responsive with increasing the feeling of personal efficacy to increase people's willingness to engage. But I'm not really sure in which part they can see that. I mean, they can see the increasing of people's willingness. Oh, I don't know what is it. Maybe you will let me know.
Then the willingness to engage means that they were really engaging more in using the application in the first study, and in the last study they were showing more an engagement by with their answers saying that they would participate in the reporting of problems they find in the streets.
Yeah, I think that in the case number
So,
3, they with the hypothetical case they have more clear about the judgment, but this is kind of assumption, right? But it's not really a contribution because it's not it happened right, or I don't know.
no, I think that this is well, this is backed up by study 1. In study 1, they had engagement with the application, with the City Connect.
Yeah.
What was the name? Application. And in study 3, they are using this hypothesized scenario for testing their hypothesis, but it's not that they are using just an hypothesized scenario. It's also there is also a real a field experiment that is supporting this hypothesis. So we can say we can buy their idea that people willingness to engage is increased by operational transparency and these other stuff that they are discussing. I think this contribution we can give it to them. The problem is that we don't know exactly how this study contributes to past studies because they didn't mention what was done before and what were the gaps in the literature. Okay, Jose, can you continue with the limitation and opportunities for future research?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Like many empirical studies that leverage field data, this research has limitations that offer opportunities for future research. For example, study one leverages proprietary data from the city of Boston to test the effects of operational transparency in promoting resident engagement, exploring variation imposed by both the resident and the public works team to conduct the analysis. Although our econometric method allows us to isolate the effects of interest as described in section 3.1.8, additional empirical support could be obtained from a fully randomized control trial. Uh, Moreover, Study 2, which also relies on data from City of Boston to test the effects of operational transparency and responsiveness on resident perceptions, manipulates perceptions of responsiveness by varying the content of the transparency itself. Although an ex-post manipulation check suggests the effectiveness of the approach, results could also build on the present studies by further testing both the content and composition of operational transparency. For example, from a content of perspective, prior research on operational transparency has focused on making operational processes transparent. E- Example showing a city worker filling a photo lead, whereas this work instead focus on making the outcomes themselves transparent. Example showing the uh, photo. Future work could shed light in the factor that determine whether providing transparency into the process versus the outcome is more likely to improve perceptions and engagement. Given the high degree of opacity in government operations, merely showing outcomes may be sufficient to reshape people's understanding and appreciation of the work occurring behind the scenes. In more customer-facing operations where outcomes are readily observed, however, providing a window into processes themselves may be more effective. Relatedly, future work should explore how the specific design of operational transparency influence customers' perception and behaviors, such as when the more provision of information is sufficient or when visual imagery is required. Indeed, in the online appendix, we present a study modeled on the Citizens Connect application, which suggests that in the government context, trust and support are most positively impacted when visual imagery is provided. However, in some contexts, the mere provision of information may be sufficient to affect perceptions. For example, online package tracking often provides information without using a visual imagery. It is possible that in contexts where trust is high and service processes are well understood, the provision of information is sufficient, but in contexts such as government, where trust is low and the process operationing behind the scenes are poorly understood, the use of visual imagery is more impactful. Delving into these moderators could inform the successful implementation of operational transparency in a wider array of contexts.
Okay. Again, let's see here what it's suggesting. Do you think the limitations of this study are made clear, explicit? Or there are further concerns that they didn't mention?
Well, they are mentioning the additional empirical studies for RCTs, no?
Mm-hmm.
For RCTs because they want to, well, they want to get more, no, like more perspective for the behavior, right? For the
Yeah, so
perception.
they are, yes. But the question is, they are speaking about limitation and opportunities for future research. In this section, usually you should acknowledge what are the limitations of your research. And here in the guidelines, you see in the first point, they are telling it's not sufficient to say adding some interviews could help. This is an example of another kind of studies, but also in their case, it would not be sufficient to say adding more observations would help. They had to say something that can help, where other researchers can help to better understand the mechanisms behind transparency and behaviors. They have provided some suggestions which are also interesting to see. But still, I think the main point is that they didn't acknowledge their distance from existing literature. I mean, the fact that there are not studies mentioned in this, not many studies mentioned in this work. And when we look at contributions of exaggerated or overclaimed, I wouldn't say that. I think the contributions are clear. The problem is that there is no literature behind them. But for the rest, I think it's a good study example. Okay, do you have questions? Anything you would like to add or ask?
So do you mean like
Okay.
increasing the number of observation is not really significant, right?
No, well, in this case, they don't need to increase the number of observations because they had a very large sample for all their studies. There are cases in which you read in the paper they are doing the analysis with 200 observations. And usually this is a limitation because it's not a very large sample. So when you go to the limitation part of this paper, you read future studies could perform again, could replicate our results with a larger sample. This is true. This is the limitation of the study, and these studies are acknowledging that their sample was limited and their results might not be as representative or representative of the more general population. But among the limitations of the study and the directions for future research, this is not sufficient. You cannot end your paper saying simply, in my paper, there was a small sample size, so future studies can enlarge the sample size. This is not a direction for future research. A direction for future research is, I have found that there is a relationship between A and B. Future studies could, but I think that also C could affect this relationship. So future studies should delve more into the relationship between A and B. A, B, and C.
But why they suggest in the end, like they want to do the empirical RCT experiment? Do they really need it or maybe
So,
not?
the last study that they have performed.
Yeah.
The third one, you mean?
Yeah, the third one, yes.
Yes, because it was adding to their more general framework. I mean, in the first study, so you have to consider that they have built step by step this paper. So in the first experiment that they have run, they were just looking at the relationship between transparency and engagement, and they were considering, okay, there is also another variable that can affect this relationship, and this is the responsiveness of the government. But they didn't pay a lot of attention to these manipulation checks or discuss it in a lot. So what they were promising in this paper was they were making three promises, if you remember. The first promise was to investigate the relationship between transparency and engagement. The second promise was to investigate the relationship between transparency and building trust on governments. And the third was to find contingencies for this relationship. And contingencies means factors that are modifying somehow the former relationships. So what they are doing in the second study is they say, okay, we have found that there is a relationship between operational transparency and engagement. Now we want to understand what is the relationship between operational transparency and trust. The second study is doing this thing, is investigating the relationship between transparency and trust, mainly. Then they are considering also other factors that can influence this relationship, but it was important to do so. And in the last study, what they have done is they have taken the results from the former studies and they have added the contingency part. So they wanted to demonstrate what are the factors that are influencing the relationship between transparency, trust, and engagement. So this is why it was also needed to build up their story.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think it's more related. They want to build kind of a story for the paper, I think.
Yes. So instead of doing just one experiment measuring everything they had promised, they are doing it step by step with a specific experiment for each of them, for each of their arguments. Okay, good. So it is a little bit later than I expected. But in the remaining part of the day, I would like you to read the second paper. I will divide you into two breakout rooms so you can work also in pair and find the strengths and weaknesses as we analyzed now the first paper. I don't know if you will be able to finish it by today, but if not, we will start discussing it next week. Is it clear, the task? Good. The second paper is see, yes, it's inclusive manufacturing. Yes. I'll give you time until okay, until 5, and then we meet again in the main room for discussing what you have were able to find so far. You have some time to discuss.
Yeah, so I can talk. I don't think we had time to discuss. At least for me, I couldn't finish the paper, so I've just started the results part. I don't know about the others.
Okay, no worries. Anyways, I could imagine that when I was to read the whole paper was not enough. So we will discuss until the results part, because I think until this point it was feasible. Let me put you the guidelines. How did you find the paper so far?
I think, okay.
Redundant? But it's the usual approach in research. You need to be redundant somehow. No. I think you should have noticed that relative to the other one that we have seen, they are making clearer what they are doing and how their study is related to the literature. Even though, and they told you this study is exploratory at a certain point, but they specifically explained why they were conducting an exploratory study rather than developing hypotheses. Right? Good. So what about the research question? Do you think it's clearly defined and stated up front in the paper?
Yeah, I think so. There's this one section where they say here are 2 research questions which we would like to answer. So it's explicit, it's concise, well written. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I also agree.
But
What about
would you suggest waiting with the research question until the 3rd page, not bring it more upfront maybe, or?
Well, it depends on the topic. Because on the one hand, you are right. The research question is the most important part in the paper, but usually it comes close to the end of the introduction because you need to introduce the literature and to explain the concepts that you are going to use in your research. So this is why, even though it's the most important question that in your paper, and it must be clear. In order for it to be clear, you need also to explain why it's novel and how it is related to extant literature. So it's common to find it on page 3 or toward the end of an introduction section. And it's not something specific to this study. You see it quite commonly in research on management, OSCM. Why did the authors perform this study? Was it clear?
I think so. They make a good point in highlighting the practical relevance, but also emphasizing that there is a gap in the literature. So they come from both point of views, and I think it's well derived why they're doing this.
Yes, so I think they have done a very great job in this paper because they are starting from a practical problem. So there is the practical aspect of the research that is important. Why is it interesting to study this topic? But at the same time, they are also highlighting what are the gaps in the literature, and they are very explicit in that. So also here, I think they have done a good job. Do you think that the study is needed? I think in this case, they are a bit cheating because, no, it's just because of the topic. They are explaining why it is needed, and I agree with them that it is important to study the topic of the disabilities in manufacturing processes because it's disabilities exist, and also these kind of people need to live somehow, so they need to work. Including them and being able to create jobs that are good for them, that they can perform, is important. And they are making it explicit on the second page. If you look at the second column at the beginning, they are explicitly saying why it is important to investigate productivity with in combination with the disabilities. So also in this case, they did a good job in emphasizing why their study is important, not only from a research aspect, that maybe it's the least emphasized in the beginning, but from a practical perspective. So overall, I would say that the positioning and the motivation of this study in general is a good one. That's a good example that you could follow. Okay. Do you think the literature is well or poorly presented? Let's say.
Is well presented in some parts, like they mention some previous studies and some guidelines, like the ADA guidelines on employments. So I think they have some practical examples for that, try to compare for the productivity on some cases.
Yes, so in general, the literature is well presented, and one thing that is important to recognize is that they are making it explicit. The research in this area is very limited. So on the one hand, they are explaining you why they don't develop clear hypotheses, but they just guess somehow what they will test. On the other hand, they are trying to tie their arguments to what is already known in the literature, and they are citing papers that are well established, and they are using arguments that have already been developed by past research. So also in this case, the theoretical framework is well established. Another thing that is very important and that we see in this paper, while we didn't see in the other one that we have studied before, is that in page 5, at the beginning of section disability, task analysis, and productivity, they are introducing also a theory. And why am I emphasizing this? Because usually also during your doctoral studies, a lot of people tell you, well, your study needs to be important, need to be practical, need to be tied to the excellent literature. They are not emphasizing the importance of including a theory. But believe me that reviewers, the first thing that will look into your paper is how it is related to a major theory. They are tying their research to the socio-technical theory, system theory. And they are building their arguments starting from this basis. So we know exactly to which discussion they want to contribute. That is the discussion on socio-technical theory and on how workplace can be adjusted to the needs of the employees. Does this study clearly differentiate or overlap with the existing literature? So here again, when they speak about the gaps, they have make it clear how their study is relating to the past literature and what is the difference between their study and the previous studies. They are telling you previous studies have investigated the relationship between disabilities and work, but what they did not do is having an empirical setting where to test this hypothesis. So this is the first difference that we have. We are not using self-reported measure or case studies, but we are building on data that we collect, on more objective data that we collected from the organization. And the second point that they are emphasizing is that they are studying the relationship of disabilities in teams, which is also another gap that they identified in the literature and that is probably going to affect employees' work. Because also in every job, you are not alone working, and if you and your colleagues can work together in a cohesive manner and can coordinate your choices, then you can be productive. If you are in conflict with your colleagues for some reason, then it's likely that you will be discussing all the time rather than producing anything. So also taking into account the team aspect rather than just the individual aspect, the productivity of the individual person with some disabilities, it's a novelty in their study. And it's something that is interesting to understand because people in organizations work with other people. Theoretical framework builds logically on existing research and hypotheses are clearly derived. Here we have anticipated a little bit, right? They are not developing the hypothesis because it's an exploratory study, but differently from the other study that was quickly saying what they wanted to investigate. In this study, they are trying to build arguments for their for what they want to test. This does not take the form of an hypothesis because they don't have literature supporting the development of an hypothesis, but they have arguments that lead them to say, why do we hypothesize that there exists a relationship between the disability, the type of disabilities, the categories, and the employee motivation, engagement, and the team productivity. Did you notice any key study for them in the paper?
Well, probably around the research question, I assume, because typically that would be very, very similar. So I guess the Harrison and Klein 2007 one would be one, if they're saying there are two measures, attributes of diversity as variety, which they are, at least in my understanding, using to explain a little bit the research questions.
So they're using it for explaining the research question, but this is not a key study for them. This is a study where they are deriving from the definition of the attributes of diversity, but they are not using it to build up their argument. They have two studies that are that you find frequently mentioned in this paper. And these are the Williams-Wilt et al. 2006, because this one is a study, yes, it's an, you can find it cited, for example, in page 1118. Where they start to speak about supervision. And the other study that is important for them is Narayan et al. 2019. But this is just because also Colella is important for them. And I'm saying these are the important studies for them because on the one hand, you are right. To derive their hypothesis, they started from Harrison and Klein, but Harrison and Klein were used just to retrieve a definition. And since they are studying a relationship between supervision and disabilities, they needed some other research that was speaking about the relationship they wanted to investigate. So in their theoretical framework, if you want to call it in this way, that is all section 3, I think they never repeated again Harrison and Klein, or maybe just once or a couple of times. Okay. Again, why are the other studies important? Because the other studies are telling you, are explaining the relationships that they want to investigate. It's like when you want to investigate the relationship between the antecedents of employees' motivation in using digital technologies. You don't build up your theoretical framework on studies providing you the definition of digital technologies, but you build up your theoretical framework on papers investigating what are the factors that are motivating employees. Okay, the methodology section. Sample selection and time periods chosen for the analysis are properly justified.
I'd say the whole point 2 is all about that and contains the whole explanation quite a lot about why they specifically choose that firm.
Yes, so I would say that they have properly justified and explained why the context was feasible for their study and for examining the relationship between disabilities and team productivity. And they have also provided explanations not only from a theoretical perspective, but also they are explaining you how they could ensure the context of the study was feasible for their study, because they are explaining to you what are their rules in the US for these kind of organizations working with people with disabilities, and they are explaining to you that this is that the organization that they have targeted has different departments, and they have targeted the CWIN department because they could find the people performing quite stable activities, but also needing some diversity in order to produce their products. So I think this part is well described. which of the following analysis is employed? Okay. Here they're building on a dataset provided by the organization. Measures. Are they thoroughly discussed and backed up with prior literature? What is the dependent variable in this study?
So that's productivity,
Mm-hmm.
which we see in the variable description chapter 4.1. I don't think they use a lot of literature for their model part, at least. Maybe because they think they have derived it sufficiently in previous chapters, but at least here they mention the Harrison-Klein, but for the Blau index, which I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's only one further reference, Gino 2012, which is about the analysis approach. So that's already empirical strategy. So bottom line for me here is that is a bit flat.
So there are two things to consider here. The Harrison and Klein that they use to calculate the Blau index is to explain to you how they transformed the input data that they had in order to use to calculate disability dispersion. So the Blau index is an index that is used to compute the similarity within a group related to a specific characteristic. In this case, it is about disability. The other variables that they have, it's true, they are not backed up by prior literature. But the good thing is that these are not self-reported data. These are data from the organization. So even though they are not backed from the literature, these are credible variables that they are using because they are using the number of hours per garment, that is one shift, if you want to call it in this way, or one production run in the organization that was provided by the organization and was not provided by the employee that was saying, I have worked for, I don't know, 10 hours today. Then they have a number of disability categories, and this is an index that they have created by themselves, which is not, in this case, if there is a literature existing, I would require them to follow some literature, some prior literature, but since they already explained that there is not much on the topic, on the number of disability categories, then they use the classification provided by the organization, and we can also rely that this is a credible measure. For the disability dispersion, again, the input variable, how they receive the data on the disability, is not backed up with prior literature because it's something that was provided by the organization. But the Blau index that they are computing for having disability dispersion, this measure of disability dispersion is a well-established index in when studying dispersion or similarities within a team. So also in this case, it's quite the variable description overall, even though it's not backed up with the prior studies, it's reliable. One problem that there is in this study is that they are speaking about studies in team. And if you look at the data compilation variables and the empirical strategy, when they decide, when they provide a definition of a team, they have team that can have also only 2 C words, which is not exactly the definition of team, because team is usually from 3 upwards, whereas couples are dyads, but they are not, usually they are not considered a team. And this is not because an argument from the street, but it's a critique that you can see frequently in the literature. So it's not going to lead to a rejection, but you need to be able to explain why you accepted also teams with 2 persons, with 2 people rather than more, because this is not the standard for a team, for the team. Okay. Covariates, control variables, are they justified, presented in detail, discussed, or is there something missing that we can say it can affect the relationships they are going to test? So which variables do they use as control variables?
So they have plenty of controls. They have the facility dummy, number of leaders, number of workers, just reading out loud the subsections here. And I think in addition to that, they also have 2 levels of fixed effects, which they mention a bit further down where it says other controls. And what was that? That was a time effect, so year, month, and weekday, and even I think garment fixed effects I read somewhere. It's a really great variety of variables in that case beyond the covariates. And then also what I wondered a bit was they were mentioning they insert the linear and the quadratic version of the covariates, but they don't really explain why they expect quadratic effects.
Yeah, it's true. And this is one of the limitations of this study, that they are introducing some quadratic relationship and they don't really make them explicit. So this can be an argument. Again, this is not going to lead to a rejection if you submit a paper with a quadratic and you don't make it explicit as they didn't. But for sure, a reviewer would ask you, why did you introduce this kind of variables, and will criticize this point. Okay, do the author really measure what they claim in the theory section? I mean, does this reflect what they were promising? They were saying we will study productivity and how this is affected by categorical dispersion in the team.
I would say yes. That's exactly what they are measuring.
Yeah. So in this case, these variables that they have created reflect correctly what they have promised, the underlying concepts. Do you think that there are other factors? We didn't see the results yet, but do you think that there are other factors that may affect the relationship between productivity, the number of disabilities that are in the team, present in the team, and disability dispersion? So they are controlling for the number of leaders, the number of workers with no disabilities. And did you get why they are counting for this? In the theoretical section, they were explaining that when that workers, individuals with disabilities, receive an accommodation and tend to compare themselves with the others, and if they perceive this as fair or unfair, this will affect their motivation on the job to perform their tasks. So this is why they are counting the ratio of workers with also with no disabilities, because usually people with disabilities tend to see as advantages people with no disabilities, and this is the motivating factors for them.
You could say that one factor could also be the company itself. We are only having data from one company, and they could be because of company values or even geography. Could be that there are some effects that we can't measure here. It's just not observable.
Yes, indeed. I expect to find these limitations in their limitation section.
Yeah, probably.
Because you are right. They have one example, a large database, but they can rely just on one organization. So we cannot say if productivity is led, for example, by the specific technologies that they are using rather than other factors that they are accounting for. Rather than the number of disability categories or disability dispersion, or if they have something specific that affect this relationship. But we can accept this limitation if it is acknowledged in the paper, because no paper is perfect, and as we said in the morning, it's impossible to control for everything. But this is a good point. And I think in general they have controlled for the most important variables that could have an impact on their relationship. So I would say it's good also this part. Okay, so I think we can finish this part of the results next week. And I would close that lecture for today now. I wish you a good evening, and I'll see you next week. Not you, Konstantin.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be on the plane next week, but see you again in 2 weeks then.
Good.
Okay, cool. Thank you for the session today.
Bye.
Bye bye.